Good morning and Gemach Simetevet, everyone. Hope everyone had a very meaningful Rosh Hashanah. And now we are in Aser Simei Tshuva. So, what we've been doing the last few classes, besides talking about certain subject matter, obviously open to all your questions. I also began discussing just without any text-based themes connected to this period in time until, I guess, we decide what we're going to do next, meaning what we're going to learn next. But this is also learning. So let me continue in that spirit. Now, of course, this is officially Hemshech Ayin Beis class. That's what we've been learning for the last 12, 13 years when we started. Well, it's more than 13 years, actually. It's when we started in 2012, and now we're already in 2025. In the centennial of the Ayin Beis. So we finished Ayin Beis. We finished the essay that I wrote that suggests the conclusion of Ayin Beis, and some themes that we were still left with. Halama Atzmi. We talked about Neir Alil Bnei Adam, Rosh Hashanah, Bit Adam Achava, and Chete Sadas. So I thought I'd continue from there. Some themes connected to the Simei Tshuva that we're in right now, going into Shabbos Tshuva tonight, and going into Yom Kippur next week. So we'll continue to have classes. As I spoke about, the schedule continues till Wednesday, so we'll have classes all the way through Tuesday. Then we'll take the Yom Kippur break, and then will be, I think, one class, and then Sukkot, and we'll take it from there. So with that in mind, and connecting it all to the Ayin Beis themes, as you can imagine, we spoke about Keser, is of course the theme of Rosh Hashanah is Tamlichuni Aleichem, crowning God as King. So Kabbalah and Chassidus talk about the Aser Simei Tshuva, the 10 days corresponding to the 10 spheres. And the 10 spheres is Binyan HaMalchus. That's what it's called, Binyan HaMalchus. In the Arizah, that these 10 days is the building of Malchus. Since Malchus on its own, Les Lo Megama Klum, does not have any energy of its own. That's the Zoyar, that's like the moon has no light of its own. So where does Malchus get its light from? Where does it get its energy from? So it gets it from the 10 spheres that are above it, meaning actually the 9 spheres. But it's 10 because Malchus is included, of course, in it. So Chachma, Bina, Das, so every one of the 10 Simei Tshuva corresponds to one of those days as we build up Malchus. So essentially, Rosh Hashanah is the initial building where God is crowned as king. And we'll talk about that in Aved in a moment. And then each of the 10 days builds it up into a full structure. So if you recall in Ayin Beis, that was a big part of, especially volume 3, where he talked about Aliyas HaMalchus. Remember, he talked about the 7 different levels that Eitz Chaim says of elevating Malchus. And then there's that 8th level, which he doesn't even count, which is ultimately where Malchus becomes higher than all the levels, like the body that feeds the soul, that nourishes the soul rather than the other way around. But those 7 correspond also to the 7 midas. There he doesn't count all 10 for different reasons, but in the Aser Simei Tshuva, it breaks it down to all 10. Just like Sfiras Eimer, for instance, also covers the 7 times 7, the 49 days. So sometimes we count 7 emotions because that's the real structure of Malchus, is the 7th of the 7 emotions from Chesed to Malchus. But in the broader sense, we really count all 10. We also include the Moichin, the intellect. So essentially, Aser Simei Tshuva is a rebuilding of Malchus, and it concludes on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the conclusion of Rosh Hashanah. That's why we say Rosh Hashanah Ksiva, and Yom Kippur is the Chsima, the being written, and Chsima is the sealing, essentially the conclusion of the 10 spheres, the rebuilding of Malchus. Now, what does that mean in Avedis Hashem? Avedis Hashem, Malchus can be explained in many different ways. I'll use the term I've often used, dignity. Malchus has dignity, Malchus tikait. When a person feels like a melech or a malka, like a king or a queen, certain majesty, majestic feeling. That is essentially what defines a human being. That's why we have an element of tzelem elikim. Due to our tzelem elikim, there's a certain element of pride, and indeed also the opposite. When something is inappropriate, there's a certain element of shame. As you see, Adam and Chava on Rosh Hashanah, after they ate from the tree of knowledge, what was the first thing they did? They covered themselves because they were ashamed. What were they ashamed of? First of all, they were ashamed of betraying themselves and betraying God. But they were also ashamed of their nakedness, of their sexuality, because up till that point, sexuality was part of the divine plan, and it wasn't a self-conscious experience. Like newborn children are born naked, they don't have any shame involved because there's nothing to be ashamed of. But as soon as a person has a self-consciousness, as their own ego, which is divorced and somewhat disconnected, or you can say dissonant from God's consciousness, so that's where shame comes in. But the shame is also a good thing, because at least there's a sense of shame and they covered themselves. What would be worse is if they're not even ashamed, where there's nothing they're not even conscious of it. Like the awareness of a problem is also have the cure. So the idea of dignity of Malchus is basically the Malchus Dekait of a person is the dignity and majesty that every neshama has in this world. And when we are born and nurtured, what happened? Was there a disconnect here for a moment? Or we're all good? Okay. For some reason my screen went blank. Just a second, I have to check something. My computer is giving some error message. 1 second. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Sorry about that.
We hear you fine for what it's worth. We've had no interruptions on our side.
Okay, something happened here. I don't know why my computer suddenly went blank for a second. Okay. So
Malchus.
yeah, no, yeah. So essentially, on Rosh Hashanah, when we say we begin the building of Malchus, what that means is that we're beginning our relationship with God. And why is it Malchus? Why is God a king? You could call God a father. You can call him a master, an Odain. Melech, we call him Melech. Melech Yisrael. Melech HaKol HaElam. Melech HaKol HaOretz. A king, because obviously the divine manifests in many different ways. The divine as it manifests as wisdom, chachma, or bina, or das. The divine manifests as chesed, the bestower and the giver of chesed and kindness and love, source of love and gvura. L'cha Hashem hagdula, hagvura, tiferes, hanetzach, v'ahid. And then there's God as king. Now, in general, the king, just for the record, when I first began learning about the idea of God as king, it rubbed me the wrong way, because we don't grow up with kings. But yes, a king is a joke. The King of England, for example, is just simply a what do we call it? A token.
Figurehead.
Figurehead.
A figurehead, right? But there was a time before the United States became a country. But in other words, before 250 years ago, and even today, there's some monarchs that still exist, that a king and a queen, they wielded absolute authority. So it's like a mashal below, the Gemara says, Malchusa da'ara ke'en Malchusa de'rakia, that Malchus on earth is like a symbol or an example or ke'en, similar to Malchus above. So just like God gives us all kinds of resources and faculties to give us a taste of godliness, just like we have love, God has love, we have love. God has chesed, we have chesed. So just like there's Malchus above, there's Malchus below. So Malchus reflects type of absolute authority and sovereignty. But for many of us, especially Americans, it rubs us the wrong way because that we don't like absolute authority, because absolute authority is also absolute corruption, as we know. It can lead to corruption and abuse, as it has throughout history, which is why George Washington refused to be king. They were abused by King George of Great Britain and the UK and so on. So the idea of king is not something that's easy for us to swallow. And yet, the idea of a king throughout history, especially kings that were benevolent and were bottle, like David HaMelech, they epitomize bittul, not ego and arrogance, is a moshel for the idea of accepting Kabbalah Soil, the idea of accepting full authority and accountability to a higher authority. So the beauty of it, the positive side of it, is really what Torah is referring to. So, of course, there's the famous question when it says, Sum tasim alecha melech. It's a mitzvah. Establish a king, which the first king was Shaul HaMelech. Shmuel anointed King Saul. Then afterwards, he was not really the appropriate king, and then came King David. And David, we talk about Mashiach, we talk about Melech HaMashiach. The king will come from the house of David. Kingship comes from the tribe of Yehuda, and David HaMelech comes from that scion, from that family line. So there's the famous question, when Shmuel Hanavi, we read about Shmuel in the Haftarah of Rosh Hashanah, the birth of Shmuel to Chana. So when Shmuel Hanavi is approached by the Jews, in the book of Samuel, it tells the story, the Jews approach Shmuel Hanavi and they ask him to appoint a king. And Shmuel rejects their request. He's not happy with their request. He says, you have God as king. Why do you need a human king? But the Jews insist. So Shmuel turns to Hashem, and Hashem says, appoint a king. And that's when he appoints Shaul HaMelech, anoints him, and the whole story that unfolds after that. So the obvious question is, what do you mean? It's a mitzvah in the Torah. Same tasim alecha melech. Appoint a king, and Parsha Shoftim. It's one of the three mitzvahs when they come to Eretz Yisrael. One of them is to appoint a king. So what was Shmuel upset about? Why did he not accept the Jews' request? They wanted a king. So the answer is a beautiful mimer from the Alter Rebbe. It's actually a mimer in Derech Mitzvah, Sefer HaMitzvahs from the Tzemach Tzedek. If you never learned this mimer, it's worthwhile learning. It's a very powerful mimer. It's not a long mimer. It's called Mitzvahs Minei Melech. One of the first Mamor Chassidus that I learned in a way that was I began to understand and appreciate. It means to appoint a king. And he asked this question, what was Shmuel upset about? Why did he not accept this mitzvah? It's a mitzvah. Because Shmuel sensed and knew the Jews were not asking because of the mitzvah in the Torah. The Jews were asking for nationalistic reasons. Just like the other countries have kings, whether it was the Persian or the Babylonian or whatever it was at the time. They also wanted a king, King Pharaoh. So they wanted it more for pride purposes, ego purposes, nationalistic pride, to be like other nations. Not a king for the real purpose of a king. What's the real purpose of a king? He explains. Purpose of a king is not to have a human being that's wealthy and we look up to and is dressed in the best garments and has all the treasures of his kingdom. Not just that, a king is most important role is bittul. That's why it's called Malchus. Les lamer gamo klum. Malchus has nothing of its own. Malchus is the epitome and the personification of bittul. In some opinions, Vahi b'shurin melech is Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is the first of all kings. It wasn't necessarily a king, the same din of a king, halacha of a din of a king like later, but he's called a king. And what's Moshe's cardinal characteristic? He was the humblest man on earth. So you could ask the question, kingship seems to be the exact opposite of humility. A king is honored. A king has to be, you have to listen to everything the king orders. The king is wealthy. He has the power to do anything. It seems like the epitome of arrogance, if anything. So the Chassidus says, no, Malchus is less lamagam klum. Malchus, the ultimate king, is the one that has nothing of his own and recognizes that everything he has is just channeling Malchus of Hashem. And he's there to be a living example of bittul, not a living example of opulence, of power, of ownership and control. The exact opposite. That's ultimately why Shaul was not the ultimate king. David HaMelech, like he explains in that Maimer, is the ultimate bittul. That's why David was not, David on his own would have been born, stillborn. And he got to receive years from Adam HaRishon and from the Ovis, as the Midrashim tell us. Because David was the ultimate bittul. Malchus is utter bittul. That's why in the spheres, Malchus doesn't have anything like the moon. It knows it's always receiving from the sun. So that's true Malchus. The Yidden, when they came to the Jews, when they came to Shmuel, that was not what they were looking for. They were looking for a king that they could laud, and they could be proud of and say, look at our king, he's greater than your king. It was for the exact opposite. It was for pride purposes. It was an ego thing. Why did Hashem agree? Because Hashem said, okay, let it be for ulterior motives. Ultimately, the king will teach them bittul. So Hashem overrode Shmuel and said, give them a king anyway. You know, there's a book I read recently, more than recently, a while ago. It's called, what was it called? Oh boy. It'll come to me. I have the book here somewhere, I think. I'll tell you the theme of the book. It's a very interesting book. It was written by a non-Jewish author. He makes the case, it's called Hebrew, he makes the case in this book that the democracy and the birth of the United States and the general concept of democracy and freedom came as a result of the Bible being translated into other languages. As long as the Bible was in Hebrew, it was not accessible to Christian and essentially non-Jewish scholars, because most of them did not know Hebrew. There were those that did, but most did not. It was when the Bible was translated into English and other languages, German and so on, that was when the first thinkers, what they call the Enlightenment, began to recognize an idea that they didn't, because until that point, everyone thought that because the monarchy. One second, let me just see 1 second. I have the book here. Because based on the biblical story, everyone thought monarchy was the only option, because they read in the Torah that says there should be a king. And because there should be a king, they thought that the king had a divine authority. So being that religion was the dominant force, especially in Europe, so they accepted monarchy as a divine mandate, and that the king and queen had some type of divine ordination. But when they read the story of Samuel with the Jews, and Samuel rejects it, they realize that it's not the only option, monarchy. And that's what began to plant the seed of a different approach, which ultimately led that we don't have kings in the modern Western world, especially not with such authority. But that's an aside. Let's just go back to this theme. So the ultimate of Malchus, from the Torah point of view, is bittul. That's what Malchus represents. So here's the interesting paradox. On one hand, a melech, he thinks ultimate authority, ultimate power. On the other hand, the true ultimate power is simply because he's channeling God's power. And if he doesn't do that, he's actually abusing God's power, and he could be the worst possible. It could be the worst possible scenario, is because it was meant to be a bittul, not meant to be something of your own power and control. So when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, when we crown God as king, what we're really saying is the following: that we are accepting with total bittul, and this is not about king as in control and power and dominance. It's about kingship as utter bittul, selflessness. And even God as king, even though we don't use the word selfless on God, but God is not about arrogance. It's about God, being the creator of all existence. And therefore we accept that with our total bittul, and as such we become malachim in turn. Because it says that the Am Yisrael is called either kings or children of kings. Like we say, just like we say, B'nei B'chei Yisrael, or Banim Atem L'Hashem Elokechem, if your father's a king, you're an heir to that kingship. But again, not out of power and control and dominance, but out of bittul. So essentially, Rosh Hashanah is a day of Kabbalah soil, and then come the Aseret Simei Tshuva is to build Malchus for it to be complete. As he explains in that mimer, a king has to have wisdom, a king has to have emotions, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. So each of the 10 days of Tshuva builds up one part of this Malchus. So by the time we get to Yom Kippur, you have not just the Malchus, the Kabbalah Seil, the Bittel, you also have a buildup of the entire infrastructure of what defines a person. But now it's infused with a Malchus Dekait, so you're using the Chachmeh for Malchus, you're using Bina for Malchus. It's all in order to serve and to be dedicated to a cause greater than yourself, which is basically the definition of real Bittel, total dedication and commitment. So in a sense, these 10 days are all the building of Malchus, which parallels, of course, the theme in Ayin Beis, where he talks about Malchus being built up from the bottom up, Mamata Lamaila, until Malchus becomes even greater than the Mashpia, but only after it has Bittel. Then it has the power to be Mashpia because it's reaching the Etzem, like we learned, Eishes Chayla Teres Baila, that it reaches the level of Keser Malchus, that's even higher than Chachma and Bina and so on. So essentially, this whole period in time is all about that story. The story of building up Malchus, all the way with all the 10 spheres, and then ultimately reaching Keser. And of course, the Keser theme, we learned at length, is the Ayin Beis is all built on Keser. The 3 levels in Keser, the 3 dimensions in Keser, 3 meanings in Keser, which is the ultimate bittul from Malchus into Keser. So that's a short synopsis, a bit about what we're right now in the process of being, which is why also it says in Arizal that the 10 days of Tshuva, 3 of them are 2 days Rosh Hashanah, 1 day Yom Kippur. The rest are 7 days. So he says those 7 days are always 7 days of the week. Obviously, from Sunday through Shabbos, depending on the schedule. This year it began on Thursday, it began on Tuesday was Rosh Hashanah. But it goes through 7 days, and those 7 days correspond to all the 7 days of the entire year, which means every day of Aseret Simei Tshuva corresponds to the Sunday of Aseret Simei Tshuva corresponds to all the Sundays of Aseret Simei Tshuva. The Monday of Aseret Simei Tshuva to all the Mondays. So these are central days that cover the entire year. For more on this, if you're following or you follow my book 60 Days, obviously I discuss it more in detail. There are actually 2 different opinions, the Arizal and the Ramak, of how we understand the 10 days. Whether you go Mamata Lamayla, Mamayla Lamata. Do you go from Chachma down to Malchus or from Malchus up to Chachma? So there's 2 approaches. The Arizal's approach, the Ramak, essentially Mamata Lamayla, Mamayla Lamata. Yet again, another theme from Ayin Beis. So obviously both of them have merit, and they both connect with each other as we've been learning throughout Ayin Beis. So that's a short thought on this Aseret Simei Tshuva. I'll stop here for any questions or comments. Obviously, if you have any other topics you want me to address, I'm happy to address. As I said, I'm just using this period during the holidays. I'll just talk about the holidays before we decide what text to continue learning, in case you're wondering what we're doing exactly. Okay. Any thoughts or comments? Anybody?
I'm wondering how Chassidic Chabad comes out because there was a whatever machlekes. It's not really that big of a disagreement, but which comes first, lamata lamayla or lamayla lamata. And I read some Maimarim during the Rosh Hashanah. It suggested that it starts with lamata lamayla with Maim Nukvim being Israel Data leads to Israel Del Ela, and that brings the Hamshacha down. We've talked about that in Ayin Beis many times. So I'm just wondering, how could the argument be made otherwise? It seems like the whole idea of us machtirim, we're coordinating God, is essentially the notion is in Kabbalistic terms, our through Bittul and our acceptance of the Eibishter as Melech HaOlam, through our Torah mitzvahs, learning Torah and doing mitzvahs, we are stimulating the Hamshacha of Or Chadash, and the Eibishter accepts that, and then he fills
So there are many Maimonic Chassidus that talk about this at length. One comes to mind, Adam Ki Yakriv L'Kutei Torah Vayikra. But there are many Maimorim that talk exactly about these questions, discussed at length in Chassidus. And there's no answer to this. Sometimes it starts from the bottom up. It could start from the top down. And there's a certain hiskalus, like we learned, there's a certain overlap and interconnectivity. For instance, the month of Nisan is usually counted from the top down. That Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. It wasn't through the Aveda so much, even though there was also some Aveda. Tishrei is generally Mamata Lamayla. But these are two orders that you'll find everywhere, whether you begin with Tefillah or you begin with Torah. And this is a very big discussion in many places in Chassidus. There's no it's not, as I said, it's not a competition. It depends on the situation. There's situations where it's initiated from below, our effort, and there are times where Hashem initiates. And generally speaking, you need both, and each one has something that the other doesn't have. And even when it's initiated below, there's also response from above. But there's Asus Le'el that gives Koyach to Asus L'Tata. These are the themes of that Maimer of Odom Kiyakiv and other places. So if you want more on this, I would simply go to the indexes in Chassidus. I don't know how well ChatGPT would do with this, but it may. And you'll find both tracks are out there, and different scenarios. In every Yom Tov itself, in every mitzvah, you find both elements. From the bottom up, the top down helping bottom up, the bottom up helping top down. As we learned especially in the essay, in my essay, we discussed at length how each of them complement each other. And there's no, as I said, there's no final conclusion, because it's not because it remains in doubt, because it really depends on the circumstance. Sometimes, for example, like, you'll say you have a student and they need extra help. So as a teacher, sometimes you have to initiate to help the student. Sometimes you want the student to initiate. So someone will say, if you have a class of 20 students, should you be initiating or should the students initiate? Obviously, it would be beautiful if the students initiated, but sometimes someone needs extra support. So think of it like case by case and different scenarios depending on the situation. You always want, obviously, a person to initiate Bishal Heva Selam Elah and own it. But take, for example, in general, children, when they're younger, they're receiving more. As they get older, they initiate more. And this is all a part of the process of growth. And just think very practically, instead of, again, not mechanically, it's a very practical question, really. What's the case? What's the scenario? Do you help your child, or do you feel in this case, let them walk on their own feet and learn through experience? So I think it's really case by case, scenario by scenario. In Judaism, you'll find all elements. You'll find both mamatla ma'ila and ma'ila. Elul, for example, is very much mamatla, anila deidi v'deidi li. On the other hand, the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim are shining in Elul. That's from above. That's not initiated by us. On the other hand, Moshe Rabbeinu was the one that prayed for Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim, so it was initiated by him. So you have back and forth, back and forth. Then Tishrei, compared to Elul, is sometimes seen more Mamayla Lamata than Mamata Lamayla. Because Tishrei, now you have the gift of Rosh Hashanah, gift of Yom Kippur, Sesame Tshuva, Yom Kippur, and so on. And then within Tishrei itself, you'll find sometimes Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are more Mamata Lamayla. Sukkot is Mamayla Lamata. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Chesed. But they're going to find so much overlap, and again, because you need both, and there's no rule of where you begin. It all goes by case, where the person is at, what they need, and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you want to have both, because both complement each other. Each one has something the other does not have. Asus La'ela, generally, like we spoke about, the two ways, when someone's on a mountain and someone's down on the ground, how do they meet? So either the one on the ground goes up, that's Mamat Lamayla. The one on top goes down, or they meet halfway, like we learned as well. So from the top down, it's more powerful because you're getting a gili from a higher place. Bottom up is more internalized. It's more you. It's more, you own it more. It's more integrated. That's a general difference. In my essay, I think chapter 6, I believe, discuss at length the Atla Ma'il Ma'il Mata, where in Ayin Beis, it discusses it in volume 2. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Just to take advantage of today, you were talking about 7-day Midas, and today, according to what you said, is a Yom Shlishi, yes?
Today would be fourth day, because
Rosh
Hashanah is 2 days. Rosh Hashanah, the first 2 days. Then comes yesterday, was the third day of Aseret Made Tshuva. Today is the fourth.
Fourth day. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, the fourth day. Shabbos will be the fifth. Sunday is the sixth. Yeah, and then Yom Kippur is the 10th. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Any other questions? Any other questions? Okay, so then let me address the following, if I may. Someone asked me, I think it was right before Rosh Hashanah, to elaborate a bit more on something I addressed. So, as I mentioned, Rosh Hashanah is the day where both Adam and Chava are created. They also sin on that day. They do tshuva on that day. A lot of things happen on that Rosh Hashanah. The Aseret Made Tshuva, of course, would be the days after Adam and Chava were created, and it's already after Chet Tzadas. So, if you go back to that period in time, that first year, that first Rosh Hashanah, basically Adam and Chava are doing tshuva right now. That's the first Aseret Made Tshuva. Now, do they have a Yom Kippur? That's a good question, because Yom Kippur didn't technically come around until after the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf. Here we're talking about the Chet Tzadas. So, on the other hand, we do learn that all the holidays that are in the Torah was given Alpaim Shana Kod Torah La'elam, 2,000 years, before the world was created. So, since Yom Kippur is written in the Torah, so even though chronologically it doesn't really manifest physically until later, we're talking about how many years later it would be? At least around 2,000 years, because the Torah is given 26 generations after Adam and Chava. That would be approximately, the year 2448. Yeah, 2,500 years from the time of creation is essentially a little less than 2,500 years. 2,448 years is the amount of time when Yom Kippur actually comes into being the first time. But you have to say that the concept of Yom Kippur had to exist beforehand. So I want to talk about that for a moment. It's a very interesting topic that touches upon also the concept of free will in a way that we addressed the other day. So here's a question in the Zohar. Very interesting question. I believe I talked about it once, and it's based on a mimer from the Tzemach Tzedek and from the Rebbe Rashab. The Torah says like this. The Zohar asks a question. Since Torah Kodma La'elam, Torah precedes the world, and in the Torah you read, Adam ki yamuz ba'oil, the laws of a person about death, a person who will die, and what the laws are. Laws of purity, impurity, even paraduma. So that means in the Torah you have the concept of death. There's no question about that. And yet, we know it says in the Torah that Adam and Chava caused death to come to the world through Chet Tzadas. The Torah says explicitly, had they not eaten from the tree of knowledge, they would have lived forever. So the Zohar asks a question, that means that they had to eat from the Eitz Hadas because the Torah talks about death. That means the Torah already had predestined and preordained death, which essentially means that Adam and Chava had to eat from the tree of knowledge, or else there wouldn't have been death in the world. So the fact that the Torah precedes existence and it talks about death, in a sense, means that Adam and Chava would have had to sin from the tree of knowledge. That's what the Zohar asks. And the Zohar gives an answer that's a bit cryptic, not clear. So Tzemach Tzedek in a mimer on Zeis Chukas Atera, and the Rebbe Rashab in a mimer Zeis Chukas Ateres, Tofresh Ayin Tes. We're learning Ayin Beis. Ayin Tes would be 1919. Discusses this. I actually wrote it up in English as well. If anybody wants it, you probably can find it easily on our website, especially with AI. And they give 3 answers. The Rebbe Rashab elaborates on the Tzemach Tzedek and gives 3 answers to this question. I'm going to touch upon one of the answers. The other two, a little more, well, they're all part of the big picture, but the main answer is this. Death has many meanings. Death, as we understand it, of course, is painful. The loss of a life. A person dies, God forbid. The family member sits Shiva, and until Tchias HaMesim, it's a source of grief, because the end of a life and the body and soul separate. What he says there is, based on the Zohar, that had Adam and Eve not eaten from the tree of knowledge, there would still have been death. But death then would have been a peaceful and a painless type of experience. It wouldn't have been what we call the separation of body and soul. It would be the death of one level to get to a higher level. In other words, the word misa can also mean bittul. The bittul, when a person, for example, transforms, let's say a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, is the death of the caterpillar, but we don't call it a death. We call it a metamorphosis, a transformation. Its shape, its entire existence has been redone. So now it's a butterfly. So essentially, that's my own example. So basically, the idea of a bittul, of one level, to get to another level is also called misa. So everywhere in the Torah where it refers to misa, death, according to the Zohar, had they not eaten from the tree of knowledge and they had that free will, it would have had a very different meaning. It would have meant that they'd elevate from one level to the next, and as a result of that, you'd need to have a certain purification as you go from one level of holiness to another higher level of holiness. So basically, the Torah itself, in other words, can be interpreted in many ways. That depends on us. So the same idea, when you talk about Yom Kippur, even though Yom Kippur did not technically exist because they had not built the golden calf, and there was no need for Yom Kippur. There was no day of atonement because they, as I said, that was an outgrowth of Moshe Rabbeinu going up on the mountain. But the concept of Yom Kippur spiritually existed also then, just like Chassidus talks about Yetzias Mitzrayim. Torah talks about Yetzias Mitzrayim. Yetzias Mitzrayim didn't happen until the year, again, 2448. And yet, we talk about Torah, talks about going out of Mitzrayim. So the meaning would be Yetzirah from Mitzarim B'Gvulim, not from the land called Egypt, because the Jews were not in Egypt yet. They didn't even exist yet. It would be more the concept, the spiritual concept of going out of Mitzrayim, which brings us to a very critical point, which you may have heard of, but it's very fundamental. And that is that the Torah Midaberes B'Elyenim Muramezes B'Tachtenim. Let me explain what that means. The Torah, everyone thinks you read the Torah, this is the narrative of events that happened from the beginning of creation through all the time till the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's passing, at the end of the 40 years of the wilderness. So it covers essentially a period of 2448 plus 40, 2488 years. That's from beginning of creation till Moshe Rabbeinu's passing at the end of Chumash. And it's a narrative. Obviously, it has many mitzvahs and many details, but it's a historical narrative. But when we say Estakel Baraisa Bara Alma, that God looked into the Torah as a blueprint and created the world, that precedes existence. That's not the story of existence. It's the blueprint of existence. And therefore, when you think of it that way, Torah precedes existence because Torah is a blueprint. It's a spiritual blueprint. Then it plays itself out in real time. So if you think, for example, a person like Avram Avinu, the archetype of Avram is Chesed. The archetype of Yitzchak is Gvura. The archetype of Yaakov is Tiferes. The archetype of Adam Arishon is Chachma, like Adam Kadmon. So spiritually speaking, they all exist before they actually lived on this earth. So if you look at the blueprint, if so to speak, if you're able to look through God's eyes, Das Elyon, God's eyes at the Torah, you see the word Adam, you see Chava, you see everything, but you see it all on a spiritual blueprint level, which precedes existence and is all in a spiritual archetype rather than an actual human being on earth called Adam. So every concept in Torah, every character, every personality, every narrative is really a spiritual narrative that ultimately evolves into a physical one. So it's not that first they went into Egypt and they were freed from there. Now we have a lesson that we have to leave Mitzarim V'Gvulim, the limits and constraints and inhibitions and fears and insecurities of our lives. The opposite is true. Mitzrayim exists in the blueprint. Then at some point in history, there's a land that's called Mitzrayim, and they actually experienced a physical bondage, which evolves from the spiritual bondage of Mitzrayim. And the same is true with every idea. So based on that, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, even though in the Torah, those mitzvahs come later, they weren't given until after Matan Torah, when we're told to do these mitzvahs, these days, these special holidays, but spiritually they existed beforehand. And that's why we say the Aves kept the entire Torah even before it was given. What does that mean? What does that mean? How could they keep, let's say, Tefillin, when Tefillin talks about Yetzias Mitzrayim? So Kabbalah and Chassidus explain, they kept Tefillin in symbolic way that talks about the archetype of Mitzrayim, the concept of Mitzrayim, not actual Mitzrayim. And the same with everything. The same with all the stories and all the narratives. Now, why is this so fundamental? Because it gives a whole other take on the Torah. Frankly, until I had learned this concept, I always had big problems with a lot of themes in the Torah that seem very strange and very archaic and very primitive, and seeming that even outdated, God forbid. But when you understand that it's Midaberes Bel Yenim, the Torah is really talking about a spiritual blueprint that then evolves into a physical reality called existence, that makes total sense. Because in a spiritual blueprint, it has very different meaning. Because there, it's above time and space, and it's not quite as tangible and empirical. It's much more ethereal and a much more spiritual level. And like I said, the idea of Avram Avinu, even though Avram passed away many years ago, but Chesed lives on. And Chesed preceded Avram. Then Avram embodied Chesed. And the same thing with Yitzchak and Yaakov. One of my dreams, I don't know if I'll ever do this, it would be more of a magnum opus type of thing, was to write a translation of Torah as the blueprint of existence and take all the narratives and all the details and explain what it all means on the spiritual level and how it all fits together as a blueprint, as a map. I mean, I do this in all my classes, but I do it more piecemeal, here and there. Whereas to do it as a full picture, starting from the beginning of Bereshis, that would be quite a project. That would require a team and research. But that's one of my let's call it, I guess, fantasies. We'll see whether ever it happens. But so that's a take that I just wanted to, which is much more than just about Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, but it of course applies to that as well. And explains a lot of questions that you may have, this concept. Okay, so there we go. Yet another idea that I shared here. I've always wanted to share it. There's never an opportunity. Here's the opportunity. Okay, are there any questions?
Can we also make the argument that if Adam and Chava did not commit, did not eat from the tree, then the Torah at that level would have been the Torah that we're going to have when Mashiach comes. So, it's the same Torah. It's just a different interpretation.
You could say that. Yes. Yeah, you could say that. Because with the Mashiach, when Mashiach comes and we will remove all the toxins from this earth, then the Torah will reflect the beautiful spiritual, like let's say the laws of death won't be death as punishment or death as, and it'll become more a blueprint for the idea of elevating from one level to the next. Exactly. Yeah. I don't know if any of you ever heard this concept before that I just explained, but here it is.
I had not, to be. I mean, honestly, what do those stories mean prior to the Bria Olam, prior to the creation of the world? So that was really very helpful, and yeah, it's been an issue for me. So I really appreciate you sharing that. That was very new to me. I had a question that's related. One of the Maimorim I learned during Rosh Hashanah talked about that because the Eibishter and Atmos in particular is beyond time, beyond any kind of measurement or rule, that essentially in God's mind, all of our so-called history, all of our reality from the beginning of humankind to Yemos Mashiach, Lasi Lavo, that in God's mind, he sees the Skira Achas, he sees it all. He understands it all. We can't wrap our heads around that, but that at least that's what I heard. And I just wanted to ask you, like, how And the point of that was that our job is to reveal the Gilui of Elokus in this world, but the Eibishter already sees it having happened. We just don't see it because we talk about the system as concealment, not as an absence, but as a concealment of Elokus. So, number one, I wanted to ask you about that. Is that a standard understanding about the nature of reality, or is that just one particular mimer of the Rebbe? And then secondly, how does that relate to what you just said about the Torah preceding Brias Olam and nevertheless contemplating an actual Yetziat Mitzrayim, for example? How do those two things, or does the Torah has different meanings at different points in time? I'm just
No,
trying
what
to
you just
understand.
described is the Torah in Ak, in Adam Kadmon,
Yeah.
is the Torah I was talking about, the
Uh-huh.
blueprint that sees the whole picture from a spiritual point of view before it plays itself out in a physical point of view. Yeah,
But
that's
okay.
that would be that's exactly that's what's called Torah. Torah originates in that world of Ak. Ak is that blueprint.
Mhm. And
As far as the
having
first question goes, it's a bird's eye view of like let's say a bird sees the entire panorama, where we only see a piece of it.
uh-huh.
But it doesn't affect our free will because it's a result of our free will, not a cause, like I explained last week. And it's like a bird's eye view, exactly that. It's like someone that is able to see the big picture.
I always thought why angels fought with Moshe to get Torah above. And I saw one explanation that actually the Torah was also on the level of their understanding. It's not only in Gashmias and what you just explained on a level of human emotions, but also on the level of angels. And so far, we might not need to know the interpretation of Torah from their point of view, but it also exists, yes?
Well, there are many reasons the angels wanted the Torah. One of them is definitely because the Torah is called a chem de gnuza, a hidden treasure, and they felt they would appreciate it more than humans. But that was not the plan. Torah was not meant to stay in heaven. It was meant to be given on earth. There's a lot of different explanations for it. Is this part of it? Well, look, the angels know Torah. The question is who it's given to. The angels are able to study Torah. That's not the issue. The issue is who owns it, so to speak. And the Torah was given down below because the kavanah was to make a dira b'tachtenim. It wasn't to have a blueprint of existence. It's to go to this world and follow that blueprint and transform this world into a home for God. And that only a soul and a body can do, not angels.
Absolutely, I understand. And what you just explained us, that death can be interpreted in a different way, not as a painful effect, but as a growth from one stage to another.
Yeah, had they not eaten from the tree of knowledge, that's how it would have been interpreted, yes.
And from this point of view, it might be related to angels too.
What does that have to do with angels?
And my point is that Torah is universal on every level. In our level, you just mentioned it. In the level of angels, that their interpretation might not be the same as ours.
But there's actual death on earth.
Yes.
So, I mean, you say, well,
but if we're
not sure how that's relevant.
But if we are talking about death as a growth, not a pain, but
yeah, but I'm not sure. But there is factual death, so the angels are aware that there's actual death. So
just the level of interpretation. I was talking about that, but thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll stop here. We'll stop here. We have to figure out how to title these classes, but I'll do that later. So what did we cover here? We covered Aseret Shemei Tshuva and the issue of Torah Midaberes
Binyan Malchus.
Yeah. And